discussing the comments received on the LANL Consent Order, and we're proud to have the Secretary Flynn here with us to lead that discussion, and also as able assistant there, Katie, I suppose, discuss it with us. So I'll turn it over to you, Secretary.
Thank you very much. Thank you, members of the CAB. We've handed out a little presentation, and really the purpose today was to give you, of our report was just to give you a summary of the public comments we've received so far in the process. Katie Roberts, the Director of our Resource Protection Division, is here with me, and she's going to just kind of summarize the different feedback that we've received so far in this process. We'll provide some direction as to where we are inclined to go in light of some of the comments, and then kind of summarize some of the next steps. The most important, I guess, change that's occurred is that based on specifically a letter I received from the governor of the Santa Clara Pueblo, who requested a 15-day extension, I decided to extend the public comment period by 15 days to May 31st, this year, May 31st. So it'd be the Tuesday after Memorial Day. So for all of those people who've decided to wait till the last minute to get the comments in, if you want to spend Memorial Day working on some comments, you've now got that opportunity in front of you. But in all honesty, we received, certainly I value the relationship with our sovereign nations. We've had some very good meetings with the San Ildefonso Pueblo, and we have some other meetings scheduled with our with the Accord Pueblos. And so in response to that request, we decided to provide an additional 15 days. You know, in my experience with respect to public comment periods, every time we set a deadline, we immediately receive extensions for deadlines. So if we set a 60-day public comment period, we would receive requests for it to be 90. If we set it for 90, it'd be 120. Really, and I think that that's the amount of time needs to be adequate to make sure people are able to review a document, digest it, and formulate comments. And I think certainly 6 weeks was adequate based on the responses we've received so far from a number of different individuals who just did this in their free time, or public officials who did this as part of their work. And so I think if those people were able to marshal the resources to actually spend time with the document and get comments, I see no reason why others can't. So based on specifically, again, it's the Santa Clara Pueblo, I was swayed by that request. I was not swayed by some of the other requests I received. We've had a number of different meetings over the past couple of weeks, and I think I don't really need to spend time talking about those. I think the one good thing is that in addition to public meetings, we've had some really great one-on-one meetings with stakeholders, like I mentioned. Katie and or me, she's been at all the meetings. I've jumped into the ones that I could, but we've had some just great meetings with all different perspectives, whether it be EPA, like I said, the San Ildefonso Pueblo, Attorney General's office. We've just had a really great dialogue and a lot of great questions, and overwhelmingly positive, I think, the conversations, even where there are areas of disagreement, there have been generally really positive conversations, and I think we feel really good about where we are today, and certainly the comments we've received from people who are motivated to actually move forward. So there's 12 sets of written comments we've received to date. Some of those are listed there, just kind of broadly speaking, and I think I've characterized that we appreciate all the comments we receive, but recognize it takes time to get into these documents, and so I think a number of these commenters have, rather than just kind of cutting and pasting, we get a lot of that too, where like one person or one group drafts an email and then we get a bunch of different comments that really essentially are just literally cutting and pasting one comment, and that's great. We accept all forms of comment, But, you know, the same comment 60 times, which we haven't even gotten that, but the same comment 5 times is valuable, and we review it. But we've received, I think it's great, just all the individual attention people have spent, groups and individuals. We've received a lot of kind of interesting and some really good ideas that we didn't even think of that have helped us, I think, and will help us when we sit down with the Department of Energy to try to renegotiate this document in the next couple weeks. So it's been, I think, a very positive process. Katie's been keeping me fully in the loop, and we've actually been making revisions into the document after we've received comments. And so it's been very valuable to us. And with that, I'll turn it over to Katie and kind of let her kind of walk you through specifically what we've heard so far and how we plan to address it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Really appreciate being here yet again. It's always a pleasure. So, as the Secretary said, you know, the comment period has been extended to May 31st. So I fully expect we're going to get additional comments on the consent order, and as he said, we welcome those comments. Today, we'd really like to just give you a snapshot of what we've received formally and verbally through the meetings that the Secretary has just referenced, and really highlight the areas where these comments have been focused. And as you can see from the slide here, really the greatest number of comments have been related to public participation, specifically that the draft consent order is somehow limiting public participation, and that NMED must allow access to any and all documents related to the consent order. I'm not going to really comment on each of the comments that we've received. I'm just kind of trying to give you an overview of what we've gotten to date. So I'm sure we'll get questions later on, and we're happy to address those. So the second largest area or focus of comments has been on the campaign approach, and we're actually really happy about that, because that is one of the areas that we requested people to provide us feedback on, because it is very, very different from the 2005 consent order, and it is one of those 4 key enhancements to the document that we have previously come to talk to you about. So, you know, I think, as the Secretary said, most of the comments we've received to date have been overwhelmingly positive. However, some concerns have been raised by San Ildefonso Pueblo, Los Alamos County, as well as the Regional Coalition regarding, you know, what happens to the campaigns and the priorities when the administration changes. And we took that comment very seriously, and the Secretary is going to discuss that and what we are thinking about doing related to address that comment. We've received several comments related to the annual planning process. The comments on this topic are really, really diverse, very wide-ranging at this point. But generally, the concerns have been whether NMED is really driving the process and the priorities in that process, and whether the process lines up with the congressional budget cycle. So I know this has been a very hot topic for a lot of people, including yourselves, so we'll be talking about that in greater length. And finally, I think the other big area are really these minor editorial grammatical changes. So EPA has suggested to change or even add some definitions to the definition section, so we're contemplating that. So I'm going to go through on the next few slides. I'm just going to really show you both supportive and opposing comments that in the areas of public participation, the campaign approach, and the annual planning process. And I want to stress that these are really only a few examples of comments that we've received in each area. If I included them all, we'd be here all day, and that's not, I don't think, an effective use of your time. So these are just some examples of the comments that we've received on public participation. And these first 3 examples are from the Regional Coalition, as well as some individual stakeholders that have provided formal comment. So as you can see, the Regional Coalition, and I'm sure Andrea can answer any questions later, but they've raised a concern about the public participation process for remedy selections, and also Mr. Zemblage and Ms. Weber feel that the consent order expressly limits public participation requirements. So just a couple more examples related to public participation. So Commissioner Trujillo was very complimentary of the transparency involved in issuing the draft consent order, and that it's really going to make the document stronger in the long run. This is an interesting comment from Mr. Alquist. He had a completely different perspective on the topic of public participation. You know, he actually went into a great deal of detail and described an experience he had with some of the local activist groups during the 2010 RECRA permit renewal process. And he really encouraged NMED to listen to those concerns, but not be unduly swayed by them. So our second big area is campaign approach. You know, as I said earlier, there were quite a few comments related to the campaign approach. We're happy about that. And as you can see, there were many comments in support of the new approach, and there were also several comments opposing the new approach. Specifically, you can see the comment from Nuclear Watch New Mexico up there. We also had several opposing comments from individual stakeholders opposing this approach. But I would like to point out one thing that I noticed as I was going through them was that the comments really appeared to be copied and pasted into individual emails because the wording was absolutely identical in each one that we received. As the Secretary said, we're going to consider every single one of those, but it's just an interesting theme throughout. So you can see that actually on the example, it's bullet 4 on this slide. Okay, so finally, annual planning process. So I provided 2 examples up here, one opposing, one supportive. And on the one hand, there's quite a bit of support for the flexibility of the process and how it takes into account the federal budget constraints. However, there's also quite a bit of concern that we noticed throughout the formal comments that we received that the enforceable deadlines are only during the current fiscal year and that they're only being driven by DOE's funding and their own priorities. And this is one I do feel I have to provide a little bit of context for because in Section 8C3 of the document, and I can point it out for you if you would like me to later on, the draft document currently says that milestones and targets in Appendix B shall be updated on an annual basis, accounting for such factors as actual work progress, change conditions, and changes to anticipated funding. So these are designed to be examples. It's not all inclusive. There could be other things that aren't named in this section that could change those milestones and targets. So now that I've walked you through some of the examples of the comments that we've received to date, I'm actually going to turn it back over to Secretary Flynn to explain some of the changes we're anticipating making to the draft as a result of these comments that we've received.
We, you know, so before I get on slide 10, I thought it would be, do we have the 2005
I do.
comments? So I'm going to pass out, I think this is a really good example of something that's kind of interesting that we deal with in on a lot of these issues. And so what I have is, I thought, because we got a lot of comments on public participation, I thought that it would be kind of important. I mean, we got a lot of, not a lot, I think we got a couple. And a lot of them were kind of the same comment, just cut and pasted. But essentially, the suggestion was that the department does not value public participation because we were not holding a public hearing on any changes to the revised consent order, and also that the department is legally obligated to have a hearing on the consent order, and that somehow this decision not to have a public hearing on a revision to the consent order is part of some larger conspiracy of the Martinez administration to suppress public feedback and public input. And I think, which is ridiculous, but I thought Katie and I were going over the comments that we received in the 2005 consent order when that document was put out for public comment. And it was actually kind of like Groundhog Day because a lot of the same issues or allegations, if you will, that were made in 2005 we're still confronting to this day. And like the document I gave you To me, it was interesting because the position that the department was taking under a different administration is actually identical to the position that we were taking under, like today, with respect to what the law requires and what it doesn't require. And so that was why I asked Katie to kind of give you a copy of this document, because I think it shows that we are proposing a different approach, but in how we're going about doing this, there's not any departure from the prior approach that was utilized. And if you look at the second, it says page 3, but it's the second page of the document. Kind of at the top, there's one comment about, comment 4, question whether there's a legal requirement and structure for public participation. And this is the department's response in 2005, was that compliance orders don't require. You're mixing up the legal process here. And on the next page has a similar comment, that comment 9, basically just saying that the department decided not to hold a public hearing on the consent order. And to me, it's not like, so there's the legal requirement, but then there's also the practical element too. So we're bound by the law. And just because we're not legally required to have a public hearing, which our position on this hasn't changed in 11 years. The department, and from administration to administration, we have the same legal analysis of this issue. But I think the bigger issue is, what do you get, practically speaking? So the law is kind of what's the minimum that's required, but would you get value from having a public hearing? And what our position has been is that public comment and public meetings, but also, more importantly, direct one-on-one meetings in whatever shape or form, that those actually provide a lot more opportunity for there to be meaningful feedback and collaboration. And I think we've seen exactly that take place in this document. We as an agency have invested a ton of time in going out and meeting with people on their own turf and in different settings. And that process is influencing us and helping to shape where we're going with the document. And I think that, I do think that that's been valuable for us. So there's for us, at the end of the day, we're going to have to follow what the law requires. But most importantly, in following what the law requires, we're going to try to, if we feel like there's going to be value from going down a particular road, then we're going to go there. And in this case, we felt like the most value we get was through talking to people in a variety of different ways and forums. And I think, again, I think that it was interesting to Katie and I, when we were looking at the comments from 2005, that, it's kind of, certain things don't change and certain claims don't change. But I do think that with respect to public participation, this process has worked very well, and we've received some really good feedback that we absolutely intend to incorporate. And so I think it's been successful in where we are. And my staff has spent a ton of time. I come to these meetings. My staff are the ones behind the scenes doing tons of work with people in separate meetings, and they've spent hours with anyone that's asked for meetings to really try to listen to them, to walk them through the document, and to figure out if there's ways we can then, after the meeting, deal with some of the issues they've identified. And it's worked. I think when we look at now on slide 10, some of the key changes that we're currently considering as we move forward, splitting the RDX interim measure and remedy into separate campaigns. I think that's a great comment. We've also received, the Regional Coalition of Los Alamos Communities had a really good comment just with respect to being able to identify and split characterization work from actual remediation, and really trying to make sure that people see what money is being spent on. And I thought that was a really good, I think Katie and my staff and I, we all agreed that was a really insightful comment, that they understand there's characterization work that's necessary, and they just want to kind of know, all right, $30 million is being spent on RDX. What is it being spent on in particular? And can we distinguish between characterization, investigation, and remediation? And we want to know that every single year. And so I think that's really important feedback. We had really good meetings with Los Alamos County and San Ildefonso Pueblo, and one of the issues they brought up was just what happens if there are, we're trying to identify a risk-based approach, and so you change this document with a risk-based approach. what happens in 3 years? Another administration comes in and they decide that, you know what, we don't want to move down this road again. How can you kind of make sure that the priorities that we agree on in moving forward will remain the priorities? And in some ways, there's no way you can possibly do that. Another administration could come in and make policy and change policy directions. But in other ways, I think there are ways that you can ensure that the public participation process that we've talked about is incorporated into this document on an annual basis, and there's more direct engagement from stakeholders as we go over what we're doing each year and then kind of what we accomplished the year before. So I think we're working specifically. We received some really good insight from the county and the Pueblo in our face-to-face meetings with them, and I think we're looking at how we can incorporate public participation into specific parts of the planning process. And I thought that was really the Pueblo and the county had a profound influence on us onto the value of making sure they're involved. They being, the interested stakeholders. They were, I think, both the county and the Pueblo, I would compliment them too on, they certainly have issues that are distinct to their communities, but they also recognize they're part of a region, and they both have been very kind of open about their desire to support the region and the facility, and obviously make sure that their priorities are also addressed. You all, the CAB, and some of the Pueblos have talked about SEPs and how they're utilized with respect to stipulated penalties, and that's something that we're absolutely considering, and I think we plan to expressly incorporate SEPs in the process. We've been going through reforms to how we utilize SEPs as an agency to correct some problems that were created in the past with how SEPs were utilized. But I think that policy change that we've made is consistent with continuing to utilize SEPs, but just making sure that they're done so in a manner where there's a clear connection, both geographically and from an environmental and public health perspective, with the violation or the issue and the SEP. So I think, the examples of where we've gone astray are, and it was kind of the Albuquerque Journal, I talked a little bit about it last week. We had, in one case, our agency had assessed a penalty for air quality violations against the facility, and the penalty was over $2 million. And in settling that, the department settled it for about $600,000, and in doing so, that $600,000 was going to be paid with a donation to two different out-of-state entities. And I'm not really, I don't want to get kind of into all the specifics and go through all like why or why not that creates problems, but in my mind, that wasn't a violation of that's a case where it wasn't that the SEP policy itself didn't work. It was the SEP policy wasn't followed. And then when we look at supplemental environmental projects, the EPA has very clear guidance. And this board has actually, in talking about how SEPs were used as part of the LANL settlement, you all specifically referenced how SEPs are used, and you cited the appropriate guidance on how you actually do it from EPA. And that process works. It just needs to be applied. You need to follow that process. And so like here, if there were a fine in the future, which I hope they're not, I hope that we're not in a position of finding them, because that means things aren't getting done that are supposed to be done. So I hope there's never a fine that's assessed. But if we do get in a position where there's some type of liability that's accrued, I think the use of a SEP in that case would be for something that provides an environmental or public health benefit to the impacted communities, not a donation to an out-of-state entity that's not going to really have a direct impact on what's happening here in New Mexico. And again, not that like some of those donations or some of those projects are bad or that entity's bad. It's just, I think, the harm occurred in a specific area, and the projects need to be performed in that area. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at, is that and that's what SEP policy always promotes. It's just, we've kind of in certain situations as an agency in the past, the department kind of got away from that, and I think it created some problems. And so I think we're comfortable using SEPs. We absolutely plan to continue forward using SEPs. And I think here, they can work very well within this document, so long as we follow what the federal, what EPA requires and what our own hazardous waste penalty policy requires. And I've talked a lot about SEPs the past week, so I apologize if it's a really boring conversation, but it is really actually, it's very important for the impacted communities, because this is, the alternative to SEPs is that money that we assess in a fine comes to the state and put in our hazardous waste emergency fund rather than going back directly into the communities. I mean, that's what you're talking about, is if we do a SEP, we're proposing, or the entity is proposing, we're approving a beneficial environmental project in the area that's been impacted by the environmental harm. If we're not doing that, then the violator is writing a check to the state that is then deposited into our hazardous waste emergency fund. So the money, when the SEP is utilized effectively, the money goes back into the community for an environmentally beneficial project. If a SEP is not utilized, the money goes back to the state and kept for the state's uses through the hazardous waste emergency fund, which is great, but we don't need $80 million in a hazardous waste emergency fund. And we think a balance there between $1.5 and $3 million is a healthy balance that gives us the room we need to address to an issue on an annual basis. We're talking about, like I said, I talked about this a little bit with Pueblo and Los Alamos County. We're talking about additional provisions requiring the annual public meeting on the Appendix B, and I think that flows directly from some of the conversations we've had with the county and San Ildefonso Pueblo and some of the NGOs. We do think we think that there should be a really clear articulation about what the plan is, what the work that's going to be required for the next year will be, and at that time each year, we think that the department and the Department of Energy should talk about what they did in the last year, what they accomplished, what they failed to accomplish, and account for how money was spent. And I think that that's the type of transparency that people want, and I think that's the type of transparency that puts pressure on us and the Department of Energy to get results, and I think that's a good thing. We've had a number of different conversations about the addition of an end date, because the document right now is really putting a priority on near-term planning, unless we haven't actually put a final date out there in the future. And I think I'm strongly, I think my position on this, and we've had a lot of talk internally, and my staff, I think, is right in that if you are paying attention to what's happening on the near term, if you're really focusing hard on what's happening next year, and then in year 2 and year 3, and you're continuing to stay focused on near-term work, that's going to lead to greater success down the road. That's going to get you a final date. That you're going to accomplish more that way than just kind of putting a lot of emphasis on a long-term date without having the same pressure on the near term. And so I think that's right. I agree with my staff in that regard. The one thing I think, and the reason why I do think that we want to move forward with some sort of end date, or we're seriously considering that, is that I do think an end date does help us advocate for budget, and that's something that is very important to us here. And so I think that without an end date, then I think it could put us in a detrimental position when it comes to advocating for additional funding for cleanup in the future. So I do think I feel like that having an end date is important in terms of really helping set expectations. And right now, the Department of Energy's, I think the assumption they're using is a flat level of funding for the remainder of the work. And this is assumptions that they have to use assumptions, and they would be the first to recognize that the assumptions change, and they get the funding that Congress allocates. And I'm not comfortable with a flat funding level. I want an increase in funding. So I do think that we need to strongly consider putting an end date in order to help ensure that there's enough pressure occurring in the near term to keep money going up. And that's our second, but our second highest priority. Our top priority is accelerating environmental cleanup. Our second highest priority is increasing funding, because that honestly feeds the first priority. So, and then we have a number of minor changes that we're making based on just good feedback we've received from people throughout the process in terms of just kind of some housekeeping corrections. Oh, finally, we are planning to increase the amount of the stipulated penalties. I'm not sure how much we're going to increase it, but I do think that we think that the current stipulated penalty provisions need to be updated. And so I think we're going to have to, we've communicated this intention to the Department of Energy. They were not wild about it. They didn't say terrific, but they understand our perspective. And my perspective was that, you know, there was an expectation that was created in 2005 that this work would be done in a decade. And 3 years ago now, the Department of Energy acknowledged that for a variety of different reasons that wasn't going to happen. And Los Alamos, in that respect, is not unique. That's basically the same process we've seen at just about every site across the complex. So it's not like they dropped the ball here or underestimated the time it would take here, whereas at other facilities they've been able to accurately predict how long it would take. But I do think that there needs to be some consequence for failing to clean up the work in the amount of time that was originally promised to the public. And so I do think that increasing the amount of stipulated penalties in order to just continue to increase the pressure on both the Department of Energy and my agency to perform is fair. And so we do plan to advocate for an increase to the current stipulated penalty amounts in the document. But again, I think that if we're assessing penalties, which we have not been shy about doing, we have the largest settlement agreement in the history of the country with the Department of Energy. So it's kind of laughable, the suggestion that we haven't been a tough regulator on DOE. It's insane because it betrays the fact, which is we've been the most aggressive regulator of any in the country. You know, when we're in that position where we're actually finding them, it's because there's been some type of failure. And we want to try to get a process in place that puts them in a position of success, because that means they're doing the work we want done. So I think that, you know, again, stipulated penalties are important. It's the hammer that we have as a regulator. But my hope is that we have a strong enough process in place where we're actually seeing work, because a penalty doesn't clean up radioactive waste or hazardous waste. And it doesn't employ people to do that work. What we want is money being spent so that people can go out and actually clean up the facility. And that's what I think most people want. So those are some of the changes that we've been spending a lot of time in internally. And those changes have come directly from the meetings and feedback we've received. So I do think that we've had really a good first 45 days. Excited about what we're going to see in the next couple of weeks, and in terms of what type of comment we're going to get. Like I said, the public comment period is still open until the 31st. So we absolutely want to hear from you, either collectively or individually. You know, we take every time you all pass a resolution, it comes across my desk. I read them each and every time. I get a lot of stuff across my desk, so there's some things that I just hand to the right staff member. I can tell you that everything I get from the CAB is considered, and I'm not saying we always agree with everything you say, but we do certainly consider everything you say. And so as a CAB, you know, resolutions are something we absolutely consider. Individual comments, letters, comments, we'll take feedback in whatever form you're most comfortable in, whether it be collectively or individually. And that's what we plan to do. After, you know, after we've completed the public comment period, we're going to sit down and start working to start negotiating with the Department of Energy to try to come to an agreement on a revised document. And I said before that I was hoping that in the July-August timeframe we would have a new document in place, and that's still my hope. I certainly hope that by the end of July we can be in a position where we have a new document that's completed. If we could have it done sooner, that would be great as well. And I do think that July is very important because as part of the budget planning process, that's when the Department of Energy starts internally working on their budget for the next, which would be right now, or next would be what, FY18? Yeah. So in July, they'll start passing up internally, right out of that time frame, right? July, August, you'll start passing up internally the FY18 proposals. It goes through the department, goes through the executive, comes out in the executive budget request, and then Congress acts. But that July timeframe is very important from a budgetary planning perspective. And that's one of the reasons why people ask us why we have the annual planning process starting in the July timeframe, and it's so that we can get ahead of the budget request. We want that schedule to be driving the cleanup, and that's why we've scheduled that annual planning process to occur begin in the July timeframe, so that we can have a forecast in place to guide the department in their budgeting process for and it's usually 2 years ahead. So that's kind of where we're going. I do think that once we get into a position where we have a revised document, that we will certainly come back and have and answer questions about that document and move forward.